And I'm joined by Ken Jenkins, our Deputy County Executive, by Joan McDonald, our Director of Operations, and Larry Sewell, who's our Budget Director. And we're also joined in the room by John Nona, who's our County Attorney, Catherine Chaffee, our Director of Communications, and a variety of other individuals within the executive branch. And we have a large contingent of our colleagues in the Board of Legislators, led by Chairman Ben Boykin, Vice Chair Alfreda Williams, Minority Leader John Testa, Majority Leader Catherine Parker. We appreciate all of their presence here today. The presentation of our budget today is an outline, and it begins the process. It doesn't end the process. The process will move from here to the Board of Legislators, where over the course of the next 5-6 weeks or so, more than that as they may see fit, the Board of Legislators will, in public forum, discuss and debate every issue, every element of this budget that we're here to talk about. They will have the opportunity to make amendments and changes to that which we're presenting to them, and then we have the opportunity to respond to those changes and then finalize a budget which will be in place on time for the beginning of the year 2019. I spent 13 years in Albany. An on-time budget was not always a guarantee. Here in Westchester County, that's never a debatable point. We intend to have a budget that is on time. As you saw from the video that we presented to you, we're moving forward, and we want to talk a little bit about the environment by which this budget has been prepared as it's presented to you. Many times we go directly to the bottom line. What's my tax rate? What's the total amount of dollars? Those figures are obviously the figures that we all want to see, but you need to have an understanding of how they fit into a whole, into a philosophy of where we intend to move the county in this particular budget, and then what it purports for the next couple of budgets. The key element in the way we approach this is transparency. We have tried, perhaps imperfectly, over the course of this year, and it's just a year ago that the voters gave me the opportunity to take on this position, that we've tried to be transparent in the things we've done. We've talked about a variety of different public policy issues, separate and distinct from the budget, where we've done it in the spirit of openness. We've had public meetings on shared services. We've had public meetings on the airport. I've had a series of coffees and conversation town hall meetings with almost all of the members of the Board of Legislators. We have the last couple coming up. Terry Clemens and I tomorrow, and Gordon Burroughs and I are coming up, and we're almost done with that. I've made an effort to go out to the local governments, the villages, town boards, and city councils of this county, and I've gotten to 39 out of the 45, so I got 6 more to do, to go out and to talk about these ideas and these issues in specific as well as in concept. So transparency is very much a part of it. And the material that you're seeing today, we have taken time to brief both the Democratic and the Republican caucuses of the Board of Legislators before this meeting. That, I'm not really sure if that was precedented before, but we believe it is the matter of the respect that the executive branch holds for the legislative branch, that they have an idea of what it is we're seeking to do as they begin their process. We have certain core beliefs. You heard some of them addressed in the video, but these are things that drive the decisions that are in this budget. Number one, that the Westchester County property taxes are kept at or below the state property tax cap. Now, it's very important to know that the perception of the cap is that it's a 2% cap, and that was the way it was originally presented, but there's a formula that goes with it. And because of past practice in the county where we had not raised property taxes, that formula allows us to raise property taxes to the level of 5.7%. That is what is allowable. This budget, as you will see, has a property tax levy of 2%. And that compares favorably to our neighboring counties. Putnam County is finished their budget at 2.4%, 2.47%. Rockland County, their budget is proposed at 2.9%. So I think Westchester County is consistent with where we were last year and where our comparable counties are and under the tax cap. And I'd have to say, if we could have gone to 5.7 at 2%, we're well under the property tax cap. But what's also important are some of the other principles that are in this budget, that basic Westchester County services and facilities are maintained for all county residents. And that's not simple. The capital budget that's already been submitted to the Board of Legislators, which they're reviewing, involves the physical infrastructure of this county, which has deteriorated. And it doesn't take a genius to figure this out. You walk through some of our parks, as wonderful as they are. You drive on the Bronx River Parkway. You see the deterioration physically of the county that has to be addressed. And we're not going to be able to address it in this budget alone or in the next budget alone. but the commitment is to understand that investments have to be made that have long-term benefit. And need I repeat what I've said at past times? It was very wise forefathers and foremothers that made the investments that created the playland, the Bronx River Parkway, the county center years and years and years ago. We are the grandsons, great-grandsons, and daughters of those decision makers, and we need to maintain that. There is also a human infrastructure that has to be maintained. When we have police officers that are on patrol, when we have people who are in the Department of Health that are going out and checking on the sanitary conditions of restaurants or of pools, we're making sure that there is a function that has to be completed and that it's being done by Westchester County government. So that human infrastructure, that knowledge and base of experience is just as essential as the physical infrastructure if we're going to do the jobs that we have to do. We need to establish a multiple-year game plan to ensure the long-term financial solvency for the county. Candidly, this budget is a bridge to that long term. We're not in a position, given our current level of revenue, to be able to establish that plan clearly for everybody to see. But in bridging from where we are through this year, we intend to visit our colleagues in Albany, my former colleagues, and discuss hosts of different revenue areas that would give us the kind of predictable revenue that will allow us then to do the investments that are necessary going forward. But we acknowledge that. We admit that up front. We're not trying to hide something or kick the can down the road to a better day that might happen someday, or only deal with what we deal with in this particular year. We're dealing in a very specific situation. And I might add, we have an X factor. We'll talk about it, no doubt, in the days to come, and that is what the impact of the SALT deduction loss will be on the taxpayers of this county and other places. Since we don't know what that impact is, this budget should reflect a certain conservative approach, and then we'll see exactly what happens as we go forward. And again, I want to highlight that the open, transparent communication is an absolute importance to us. This budget is going to be online, if not by the end of the day, then very shortly. So everybody will be able to look at it. Our friends in the press, our friends in the population, the 1 million people or so that live in Westchester County, will be able to look at it and see it for themselves. We have a series of pragmatic decisions that are before us, and we have to look at them in light of the world that we live in. We have to make a case on our county finances to the various bond rating agencies, to Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch. They have looked at what was traditionally a AAA bond rating county, and they've seen us decline. We've been downgraded by one. We've been put on negative outlook by a second one. And these are fair assessments of where we are today. We have had to go into our fund balance over the last couple of years. We'll highlight the numbers in a second, which make for a difficult reality. And coming out of a business background, much less my prior government experience, I don't want to see a fund balance that's inadequate for the emergency that we don't know is coming. It's not a prudent thing to do. But given the climate where we are today, we need recurring revenues that exceed what we can realistically expect our property taxpayers to pay. And that requires us to look at a host of other revenues, which we'll talk about in a second. But for the meantime, both the bond rating agencies and the New York State Comptroller's Office have rightfully been critical of the process and the decisions that we've had up to this point. Their fiscal stress report puts us, along with a couple of other major counties, in high fiscal stress. And the recent audit, which I asked for, I signed a letter my first day in office, asking them to do the audit. They've come back with an audit, and they've highlighted some concerns in the way we've operated and an indication that as we respond to that, of how we're going to change our behavior over the course of the coming years to address some of these concerns. And we think it's a very helpful process to have these evaluations. And if they're negative evaluations, then we need to hear the negative, and we need to build off of that. We also have to make an honest assessment of actual tax impact to homeowners. There is a tendency to view just what happens in the short term as being enough to get you through the day, but they book in long-term impacts. This budget includes non-recurring revenues to balance the budget. Let me be clear, one-shots. There are those in these budgets. They're put there out of necessity, not out of philosophical desire to reach a magic number. And it's important to know that in some situations, such as past practice, we are not borrowing to pay for pension costs, as an example, in this budget. And that is part of the process for us to right the ship. We will show you in a few seconds where we are borrowing to pay for certiorari expected payments, and that is not what I would prefer to do over time. So I hope, while that might be a 1-year or a 2-year strategy made by necessity, that we can change that as we go forward and put ourselves not just on a firm financial footing, but on a financial policy level that puts us back to where we were for all those years as a AAA bond county, not just because we had the financial wherewithal, but we had the procedures and the policies and the willingness to show the bond market that we could meet the obligations that we contract for. But that requires a longer-term thinking that will go beyond any single budget. And then also, I think it's absolutely critical to go back and remember exactly what is the relationship between county taxes, municipal taxes, and school taxes. Because when I talk to people and they are unhappy about their taxes, they don't make a differentiation between the different component pieces. But by the same token, when any one of those three pieces either restrains their taxes, lowers their taxes for a year, they don't feel the benefit of it. They're still just as angry over their property taxes. So it's important for them to understand what portion of that is within our control, so that when we make choices about spending money or not spending money, they recognize what the correlation between the dollar impact in their wallet is and the correlation of what that policy is. If you assume that people don't know what county government does, then you can slice it and dice it. But once you understand the diversity of the things we do, an honest understanding of what we're mandated to do, what the state and the federal government's mandated to do, and what we believe we're mandated to be responsible for, things that may not be legally mandated, but are morally mandated, things that are procedures and programs that have been in effect for years that we shouldn't just shut down because of the concerns of the moment. In terms of our management philosophy, and if you'll note, and I say this with great pride, we're a new administration of almost a year. It was a change of political parties in last year's election. But we did not go through the management team of this county and fire everybody in order to bring a host of new people in. We made what we thought were good improvements and changes by bringing people in certain areas, but the fiscal policy team, Larry Sewell and his team in budget, Anne Marie Berg and her team in finance, we maintained that in place. You won't find that often. And that's a statement to be made about a fiscal management process that respects professionalism, not politics. And that's not always what you see in these situations. Over the course of the policies that we have for fiscal management, a few things apply. We've imposed a hiring freeze. We will make some exceptions on it where we have a director of department or a commissioner of a department. But in general, we have a hiring freeze that we've imposed to stop and stabilize where we are. That we expect will be lifted at the period of time that we expect will happen early in the new year, possibly the end of January, beginning of February, when we expect to find a number of individuals who will submit retirement papers. We believe that the long overdue CSEA contract has held a number of people waiting for that to happen so they could close out, get retro pay, and then over the course of going into the new year, getting whatever benefits they're legally entitled to, that they would depart. And we'll talk about what that financial impact is. But we will lift the hiring freeze at that point in time, and then each of the commissioners, and we have quite a few of them here with us today, will be making individual decisions in their respective departments, however small the department is, however large the department is, over which of these positions must be replaced immediately, which we can hold off for 3 months or 6 months or 9 months in order to receive some one-time non-recurring benefit of that. But the hiring freeze is one element of it. We've looked, this administration, and I want to compliment Joan McDonald as Director of Operations and John Nona as a County Attorney. We've looked at existing contracts, not with a desire to blow things up, but with a desire to analyze whether or not we think that these contracts have been done in the best interest of the county, or could we improve them. Members of the Board of Legislators reached out to us in the transition period last year and encouraged us to take a close look at the Liberty Lines contract. And that's exactly what we did. Both John and Joan spent time, serious negotiations with Liberty Lines. We have great respect for their organization, great respect for the work they've done in managing their portion of the bus system. We came to a mutual agreement, a new contract that saves the county $4 million a year. That is an example of fiscal management. And I compliment John and Joan for their work on that and other people on their teams that made that happen. And I compliment the management of Liberty Lines. That is the prototype for how we look at different contractual arrangements. We've had a willingness now to look at the way we provide health care at the correction facility. We extended an existing contract, gave us a savings within this year of a couple $100,000. Commissioner Joe Spano and his team we'll have the opportunity to now go through an RFP process and determine what's the best way to provide the right type of health care, and we've done already that type of diligence to help us show fiscal management. We've had a robust shared services effort where we were behind the state standard, and we patterned things that Suffolk County has done and others. We brought in some real experts on that under the hard work and direction of Emily Saltzman. We have a very good plan in place and a plan that we intend to grow in shared services. The financial compensation from the state won't occur until the year following, so we don't see any financial benefit from the shared services initiative in this budget, but we expect it to come. And initiatives that predated our administration, such as the arrangement in Mount Kisco with the county police department, we believe are going to be replicated. We think there are other examples of that coming, and we think that will be representing a good fiscal management strategy. The CSEA contract includes a health care contribution. It was controversial. It was a factor in the margin of ratification of the contract. But we felt that there had to be a contribution. It did not have to be standard at every pay level, but there had to be a contribution toward health care. That is the reality of life today in America. And the willingness ultimately of the union to accept that allows us to moderate our costs as well. We're in a process of assessing our county space allocation. We've completed the process, and now we have to have a discussion separate from the budget with the Board of Legislators about the policy implications, because we have leased space in different corners of the county, and we have county-owned space. We can contract into vacant county-owned space some of the leased space, but that owned space is not equally distributed geographically around the county. So if we have a couple of departments in leased space in New Rochelle, part of it is to create an economic presence in New Rochelle, and that economic presence in Ardsley or Mount Kisco, and to contract it all back is really a give and take. And we'll have that discussion with the Board of Legislators, and we'll come to some mutual understanding of what we can do with that. And I think we've done yeoman's work in the capital project plan. I compliment Joan McDonald and our new Commissioner, Hugh Grecian, in their willingness to try to move forward our capital projects, their capital needs at every turn, and we certainly think that that is important. Let's review what our county services are. And it's very important to understand, and I know members of the press understand this is old news, and certainly legislators and individuals involved in the government, but it is not at all clear to people exactly what the county government does. We're a regional government, and as a regional government, we're not the primary provider of certain types of services, but the service itself involves county role that may be invisible. We run an airport and we run a bus transportation system, but there are many people in this county that don't use the airport, and there's any number of people in this county that never get on a Beeline bus. But we still have those functions because there are people that use them if they're not used universally. We maintain a parks and recreation system. As we have these coffees and conversations around the county, which frankly I love. I'm with John Testa in Peekskill last weekend. I'm with Terry Clemens in Pelham. In Pelham, they talk about Glen Island. In Peekskill, they'll talk about issues that relate to things in that area of the county. It's an extensive park and recreation system, which not everybody uses in all parts of the county, but is there for all folks. The role that we have in sewage disposal. Most people don't want to think about what happens once you have completed your role with sewage. But you think about it a lot if something doesn't work right. And we have a responsibility, and not only because it's a matter of public health, but because we're heavily monitored by the state and federal government in terms of the effluent of that process into the Hudson River and to the Long Island Sound. They are our two greatest physical assets and reasons why people view Westchester in the way they do, the beauty of that river, the beauty of that sound. And we have to make sure that what we put into those sounds are environmentally sensitive and proper, and we have that responsibility whether people understand that or not. We have a role in the garbage and recycling function. It might be, if you live in the village of Mamaroneck, you see a village of Mamaroneck truck come up and pick up your garbage, but it takes it to a regional transfer center in which the county then takes it over and takes garbage to Charles Point and recyclables, in that particular case, to the Murph and Yonkers. And we have a tremendous role in that area. We have a role in protection of our people. We have a county jail function. Hopefully nobody has served inside the county jail. I wish all of my colleagues in the state legislature could say that. We've had people who have no idea that we have a county jail, and the number of people that we have to allocate to manage that, and then the probation function that follows the county jail. And now we have a mandate for Raise the Age so that we treat 16-year-olds this year, 16 and 17-year-olds next year differently than the adult population. It's a good public policy, and it comes with its costs that we're going to talk to in a second. We alluded to in the tape that we have public health inspectors that are out looking at all of our restaurants. You can see by my waistline, I'm very familiar with the restaurants of Westchester County. And we walk in just assuming and knowing that they're safe, that there's no problems that we're going to have in terms of public health. And that's because somebody who's professionally trained systematically does those inspections to make sure that that's the case across the board. And the same is true with our pools, public and in some cases community pools within certain complexes. Our shared services with municipalities, the way we handle emergency dispatch. We are involved in civil service administration. We're responsible for safety should there be an incident at Indian Point. Pete Lauren and John Cullen and the people in the Emergency Operations Center have to respond, and we practice how we would respond were something to happen. We had, as a county regional government, we had a tabletop exercise on 2 consecutive days to deal with what would happen were we to have an active shooter in a school, putting peoples from municipal governments and school districts around the table to talk through these different municipalities. That's what the county government does. So when somebody says, I don't know where my money is going to, it's our responsibility to make sure they understand that. And many of those services are mandated. The county budget for this year totals $1.94 billion. That is an increase of $98 million over last year. So in my video, I actually said $1.8 billion. The actual number now is $1.9 billion. And in a second, I'll show you what accounts for what amounts to $98 million of additional spending and why that's part of that process. We have the responsibility, as I've just described, to provide certain services that we're mandated to do and others that we think are required. And the cost of those services totals $1.9 billion. We also have the responsibility through the not-for-profit organizations in this county to provide services that they provide better than we could provide if we had to directly provide it. And I do not look at our nonprofit community as getting a handout or a member item. They are providing a service that is necessary in this county. Our ability to help fund them is to accomplish a policy end that is necessary, whether it's daycare or help in a host of different areas to a host of different entities. We are, by the way, making sure that all of our county employees are being paid the minimum wage, now required by law at $12 an hour. Whether or not county governments are exempted or not, that is proper that we do that. And we're increasing our support for daycare programs, our not-for-profit service providers, and we have to implement Raise the Age, which I just alluded to before. That is, in round numbers, a $40 million expense. You will see it in this budget as a series of expenditures and departmental structures, and you will see an increase in the state aid revenue number that correlates to the commitment that the state has made to pay for our first-year costs dollar for dollar. I think we've estimated that about $38.5 million. We allude to it as a $40 million cost. We're going to move forward together, and in that regard, I have briefed both the Democratic and the Republican caucuses on what our plans are. The dialogue in the days to come include all members of the legislature and all members of the community. We're not shutting anybody out of expressing their opinions. And we understand that in a small d democracy, people disagree. We respect that disagreement. That's why we have those coffee and conversation round tables. And let me say, as an elected official, I respect the role of the press. There are times I may not agree with what you've written or reported. There are times I wish I could have had you reported it or positioned a different way. It is not my or any other elected official's authority to do that. It is your right and your responsibility to report the news as you see it, as fairly as you do, whether I like it or anybody else likes it. And I think every elected official should take that position. When we close the books on 2018, we have back-to-back years of deficits, and we had to go into the reserve fund in order to pay for these. There was no other place to get the money. The budget that we're presenting in 2019 does not go into the reserve fund to balance it. And there was quite a lot of debate, speculation that we would do that. The reserve fund is compromised at the current level of $71 million. That is an extremely low number. It is not a defensible number, except that we're dealing with reality, and we intend to take this as the bottom and start to work our way back up to what should be prudent and reasonable. But you have to reference that in 2017, we closed that year off. We did it earlier this year. Those of you in the press covered this at a $32 million general fund operating deficit. And just as a reminder, a significant portion of that was for projected airport revenues on the deal that was presented at the tail end of 2016 that didn't happen. And then some of it involved union contracts and then some other expenditures that added up, a smaller amount that added up to the 32. This year, we're projecting a general fund shortfall of $39 million. Now, we don't close the year off until next year. That $39 million is also going to come from fund balance. And we could, in theory, spike property taxes. We could try to break the cap. It would be irresponsible to do that. We're not going to do that. And I think the taxpayers of Westchester County, and some politically may have expected us to do that, but we're not going to do that. But the $39 million gap, it was originally projected at the end of the first quarter at a $29 million gap. It reduced down to $18 million when we saw the projections at the end of the second quarter. Sales tax revenue during the year was very robust. Had no other factors been in place, we probably would not have had a gap at the end of this year. However, we closed the CSCA contract. That had, in round numbers, a $34 million hit in the current year because of the retro. No money was set aside for 7 years with the anticipation that this contract would ever be closed. Not a dime was set aside. So I don't complain. We just resolve things. We waited 6 years to resolve Miller House. We waited 7 years to resolve the West Help. We're in the middle of trying to resolve Memorial Field. We will do what has to be done. And we'll do it responsibly, and we'll explain it. And that's why we're into the fund as much as we are, and we intend not to go into it from this point forward. But that's why we have a rainy day fund of $71 million. Let's pray for sunshine. Now, to move ahead to talk about this budget, the budget deficit is $60 million as we begin the process, not the end product now, begin the process. I mentioned there was, and here's the math, I mentioned there was $98 million of additional spending this year over last year. Of that 98, the pass-through of Raise the Age is about $38 million. So you take 38 off of 98, you get $60 million. That's what we have to close. And how we go about closing that is really what most people are going to be interested in, the substance. Let me just mention again the specifics on the expense increases. Raise the Age, $38.3 million, as best as we've estimated. I want to compliment Rocco Posey and Michael Orth and all of the individuals that have been involved, particularly Commissioner Posey, in implementing this. This is a mandate that has come at warp factor 6. They've worked with the Woodfield Cottage setting to put together a game plan, so much so that we got calls in Westchester from my colleagues in Nassau County, can you help us out? We can't make the October 1st deadline. Suffolk County, we can't make the deadline. Can you help us out in Westchester? We were already planning to provide those services for a number of Hudson Valley counties as a regional center. So Putnam, Dutchess, Orange, Rockland were already baked into the cake, and I think we go as far up as Broome County and maybe further north than that. But in this case, by being responsible and moving to try to implement this mandate at 100 miles an hour, we were ready on October 1st, as ready as we could be on an interim basis, and I compliment the professionals led by Rocco Posey that helped do that. That's a $38 million increase of expenditures. Debt service is $14 million. That reflects the capital projects that we've tried to move forward. We've had a backlog of capital projects. As I've mentioned previously, both Joan McDonald, Hugh Grecian, and let me also compliment Ralph Butler, a former commissioner of DPW who we brought back for consulting work to give you a hand. We have an undersized DPW department. Mary Jane Shimsky has talked about this time and time again as a legislator, and she's been right every time she raised the issue. And in the process of trying to get through these contracts and move forward, we have a debt issue, and that debt issue is reflected to a great degree in that. You'll see $7.9 million in municipal sales tax distribution. Back in 1991, when the county last had an increase in sales tax, it involved a share back with local governments and school districts. Exempted from that would be the 4 major cities which have their own sales tax arrangements. So all of the other municipalities and the school districts each got a share of the additional 1% in sales tax. So we grossed up the amount of money that we got from sales tax, but we had to share back a small percentage of that, and that share back percentage is this $8 million. And that's projected in this budget. The labor contract's $31 million. That's not just CSEA, that's also the uniform services contracts that were approved about a year ago before I took office. We did not disagree with the effort being made to close out the corrections officers, the superior correction officers, the police officers, the superior police officers, the Teamsters. All of those contracts were closed before the end of 2017. They had financial retro implications as well as current level impacts on them. And that cost factor, along with CSEA is by far the biggest piece. That represented $31 million. And the bus operations of $6.7 million would have been a $10 million cost were it not for the renegotiation that John and Joan did that I referred to. So that's the breakdown of the $98 million additional spending. I highlight this because if you're going to have somebody write a headline to the news article that you're going to research and put out there, somebody's going to say, county spends more than last year. The average taxpayer is going to see that and say, well, what are you talking about? Don't they understand we have high taxes? We understand you have high taxes. That's why we didn't go to 5.7, which we could have legally done. But the breakdown of where this comes through, the pass-through of raise the age and these other things are essential in understanding the content and the substance of why we are where we are on the expense side. And let me just mention on the expense side the kind of costs that we have that are mandated. We pay, in this particular expenditure budget, $211 million to the state for the Medicaid program. We're the only state in the nation that has the responsibility for county governments and the city of New York to pay for Medicaid as a state legislator, along with other state legislators of both parties. In the suburbs, we've long argued that this mandate should be phased out, but it exists. And that's $211 million that we can't negotiate, we can't reduce it, we just have to pay it. And similar to that, we get a mandate on pension costs. This is our contribution to the New York State pension system to be fully solvent. Our system is much more solvent than Illinois or New Jersey, a number of states that are in dire straits. And yet our cost on that is $83 million. That's not a negotiable number. That has to go out the door. And so when people say, well, what are you doing with county government? Well, some of the things are within our authority, some of them are not. As you go down the list, they're larger numbers, they're smaller numbers. We make a contribution to Westchester Community College. Frankly, it's a smaller contribution than we should make. Margaret Kunzio has been an advocate, so is Alfreda Williams, to do right by the community college. And hopefully we can do that if we find additional revenue as it goes forward. We have a responsibility to provide the corrections function. As you can see how expensive a function that is. We're responsible to handle indigent criminal defense. That is a county responsibility as tasked by the state. That's a $20 million expense over the course of the year. New York State court facilities, we'll have a lot to talk about with that in the coming weeks, as we are the landlord for the court system here, although we have no direct control over the decision-making process of how that works. And then on down the line, elections, public health, and so forth. The revenues of the county budget are not accurately displayed on that slide. So why don't we move to another slide? Move to another slide since that's not accurately portrayed. Hit another one, Joe. Thank you. And I'll explain it to you verbally. It's helpful when you know the budget is aside from looking at the slides. Bottom line is this is something important this year. I think you have to understand, and we're freely admitting this. None of this stuff is hidden. This is the first year where our sales tax revenue estimate exceed our property tax revenue estimate. Historically, most municipal governments get more money from property taxes than they do from sales taxes. The one exception jurisdictionally here in Westchester County is White Plains, which always has drawn, because of its robust downtown shopping reality, has always had more revenue from sales tax than property tax. This year we crossed that line. Now, there's jeopardy in that. The jeopardy is if the economy were to tank beyond our control, national economy, and sales falls off, we lose a revenue stream that we project, but we can't guarantee. Property tax is guaranteed by warrants, and in this county, the municipalities are responsible for paying us 100% of the warrant we send them. That is also unique. That's one of the biggest reasons why we had a AAA bond rating for all these years. But when we send the bill out to each of the different towns and cities and they pay us 100% of that money back, that's guaranteed money. The sales tax revenue that we project is projected. We've had a very robust year in sales tax. Our professionals under Larry Sewell's direction have given us a projection of what we think we can additionally see in sales tax. This does not include any projected increase in sales tax rates in the future that we may yet discuss. This is projected on what we have now. We do believe that the state will authorize internet sales taxation, which has been upheld by the Supreme Court fairly recently. And most states that could have acted to implement that if they needed enabling legislation. New York needs enabling legislation. We expect that to happen. So we expect that our sales tax revenue estimate, which is $578 million this year, up significantly over the projected, over the budgeted $535 million. The projection of it is higher than that. But we projected $578 million in sales tax revenue. Our property tax revenue, we projected at $570 million. And that is on the basis of a 2% property tax increase. All of these numbers subject to the discussion and the debate and the approval of the board of legislators, which has the right to adjust any revenue or any expense they choose. The only thing that they're required to do is to balance it off at the end when they finally adopt the budget so that the revenues do match the expenditures. You'll see some other revenues up there. Federal and state aid is really the third biggest category. As I've mentioned, you'll see a spike in that in this budget because of the impact of the Raise the Age situation. We are not touching the reserves in this, and we think that is the right strategy. I know this is kind of long and drawn out, but I'm believing that you're interested in the substance, and you should have the substance, and then as you go through the budget, you've got a sort of a guide to walk through it. The number of positions in county government. We are having a net increase of 11 positions in county government. Now, keep in mind that we're dealing with a county government that employs over 4,000 people. That number is down significantly over the last number of years. There was a time when it was a 5,000 number after we spun off the hospital 20 years ago, and the numbers were even higher than that. But at the level of positions we have now, the net increase of 11 reflects in that inner box the increase of bodies that we have to have on staff to handle Raise the Age. And as you can see, if you do the math on that box, that's 26 additional positions, primarily probation at 12, social services, DSS at 6, 4 in mental health, 3 in the law department, 1 in the district attorney's office. The remaining positions throughout the government are a reduction. The heavy reduction, home and community services, is services function through DSS. And so the net result of all of this is an increase in 11 positions in the county government. And that is how we budget it as we go into the year. The issue that I've just mentioned before about who might retire, how we might fill retirements, do we zero out lines, those are all questions to be dealt with. That number certainly could fluctuate during the course of the year. But this is not a padding the payroll scenario. Raise the Age is the reason for the increase in body count. Important to know that so our friends don't misrepresent it. Now we get down to the brass tacks. How do we close the budget deficit of $60 million, which I've outlined previously? We have a number of decisions that we've made which are non-recurring revenue. Non-recurring revenues are often called one-shots, and I've been critical of them in the past, and I'm critical of them today, even as I do them. Because in the response of transparency, you have to be honest. We're dealing with a situation where we can deal with property taxes increases on a very limited basis. The body politic does not allow for us to get through property taxes additional revenue that would satisfy our challenges, and we don't have the authority, unless Albany gives it to us, to do other types of things to raise additional revenue. We'll point out in this list a couple of additional revenues, but in some cases, the money that we have to balance this budget will come from one-shot arrangements. However, I would highlight this is very different from changing the governance of the airport. The airport is a main function of county government. And I was, I think, properly critical, and the board's position was this in 2 consecutive years, that they were not prepared to make a 40-year deal based on the finances of the moment. Now, should the board have discussions about that particular topic or anything else, that's perfectly fine. We'll engage in those discussions. But the arrangements that are here represent what we think are reasonable actions. They're certainly subject to debate and discussion. $22 million involves us taking the county center parking lot and transferring it to an LDC, a local development corporation, which we have created already, and that is the leadership of which are individuals that we have appointed through the county government structure. It is a transfer from one balance sheet to another. It saves us $22 million, and if you turn that into a property tax increase, that's 4 percentage points of property tax increase by making this transfer. We do not have direct county control over the parking lot. You're familiar with it when you go up to the county center. You turn right if you're going north, left if you're going south, big circular lot. You use it on all of the different major events that happen at the county center. Maybe some people commute out of it every day into the city, whatever the arrangements are. That transfer will save the county $22 million. We are going to bond for our tax certiorari's, and the act of bonding, financing it, we believe will be $8.5 million this year rather than whatever the full amount would be. I would prefer that we do not bond for certiorari's. I'd prefer that we were able to put a set of money aside, and we thought that it would cover us. But again, we have to deal realistically with what we're facing. We're not bonding for pension costs, and we've now eliminated that at the end of the smoothing process, and the hope is that in a future year we'll be able to avoid bonding for certiorari's and just pay out in the year based on an allocation of money in the budget. But for this year, we'll be bonding for it. We've drawn down $8 million from our health fund surplus. The surplus was $13 million. This brings it down to $5 million. This is money that is set aside that would handle exceptional health costs that may occur from the various people that are in various degrees of coverage. We'll certainly give you more explanation at the board legislative level, and then anybody in the press wants to get into this in greater detail, Larry Sewell will be happy to address that. We have made a vacancy factor estimation of $7 million from those early retirees. We don't know specifically who's going to retire. We estimate it to be in the vicinity of 150 employees, and we're making rough estimates about how many of them will restock at the end of 1, 2, or 3 quarters, and what we save out of that we think will total $7 million. We budgeted $5.3 million for money that we will receive back from IDA recoveries. Most recently, Avon in Rye made the decision that they were going to close their operation. They were beneficiaries of IDA funding, and because they haven't completed the time for that funding, they owe us back a certain amount of money. Situations like that throughout the course of the year we think will add up to that $5.3 million amount. We're drawing down the full amount, we believe it's the full amount, of $2.25 million from federal and state transit aid from past years. We were compensated on a formula by the federal government for transit aid. There was a surplus left over. We put it in a fund. That fund accumulated to a certain level. We're drawing it down now and zeroing it out in order to balance this year's budget. We've identified $1.1 million in additional fees and rents through the Parks and Recreation Department. That breakdown of what types of fees at what level will be explained in some great detail when the board reaches that particular departmental budget, and they'll have discussion about that, determine if they're comfortable with what we're proposing and what the dollar impact of those fees are. We identify that there's residual parcels and some space consolidations that will total $1 million in savings. There's some individual parcels where in private conversation I might identify them. I don't want to negotiate in public, so we can identify at the proper time some of those parcels, and we intend to sell them. They're not parkland parcels. They have some value to some individual or communities or what have you, and we intend to move them for the sake of $1 million. I'm not going to go every single line down with each of these other things, but let me just mention a couple of revenue areas that are important. The $800K in energy demand, that's a revenue, and that's a new revenue. We have signed a contract with New Energin, which is an organization that indicates that the county can receive revenue if we reduce our electric demand in periods of high peak usage. Think summertime heat wave, and in so doing, we will go to our generator system to power most of our facilities. We're not going to do it at Playland in the summer, but we're going to do it in other different areas of the county government. And as we've done this survey now, Peter McCart from our team is involved with that directly, and we believe that what we do to reduce our energy demand will allow us to get as much as $800,000 in revenue. It has been projected at a much higher revenue. We took a more conservative number as a revenue, and hopefully we'll overachieve on that number. We have a number of $500,000 down for hotel tax parity. All of the hotels in this county pay a hotel occupancy tax, usually a 3% tax countywide, and then a number of municipal governments have also levied a 3% tax on the bill. Those organizations, Airbnb is not the only one, but they're the one that we all know the best, that have this new way of home sharing. If in a car it's ride sharing, then I guess it's home sharing, and you can stay in somebody's home and pay an overnight fee as if you were staying in a hotel. they have not been paying hotel occupancy tax. So we have been negotiating with the major one, Airbnb, for a commitment to pay a certain amount of revenue. And the Board of Legislators recently dealt with legislation that would allow that definition to include these types of entities, and we believe that's a revenue of $500,000. Home improvement license and fine enforcement. Our Consumer Protection Director, Jim Mazzano, has taken over the job with great gusto, and he has identified for us that he believes that his department alone can generate $500,000 in revenue by the way the licenses are handled and the fees on the licenses, and then also by the enforcement. And in this particular industry, the established organizations who are licensed benefit from licensure and enforcement, because it's the fly-by-night guys that operate without licensure and without, sort of the honest business dealings that oftentimes scam residents that can be fined and can generate revenue in this area. And there's a host of other areas, smaller areas that add up to this. But the bottom line is this is how we close the $60 million deficit that we found. And again, we've done it without going into the reserve fund. We have done it without any massive layoffs. We've done it without what I would argue, and subject to the board's agreement, any major change in delivery of services. We have a property tax bill that each of us pay, and it's composed of, in most cases, 3 different levels of payment. It breaks down a couple of different ways. The county bill is a county bill. There's a sewer tax bill and a refuse bill. If you're in the refuse district and a sewered, we have, in Community A, a library tax, and Community B, a fire tax. It differs around. But in general, you have 3 basic revenues that you have to pay out: your school taxes, your county taxes in the aggregate, and your municipal taxes. If you live in a village, that means village and town and library and all these other things I've just talked about. In general numbers, if you pay $20,000 a year in property taxes, you pay about $13,000 of it to your school district. You pay in the vicinity of $3,500 to $4,000 to the county, and you pay something in the vicinity of $3,000 to your municipal government. Yonkers is a different story because of the way schools and municipal governments fall under one entity. But for all the rest of us, that's the way it breaks down. It's important to understand that the 2% we're talking about applies to your county portion of your tax bill. So if you're paying $20,000 a year in property taxes, which is above the median property tax, we know there are people paying a lot more than that in this county, but there are people paying less. At a $20,000 total property tax bill, assuming you're paying $4,000 to the county for your county tax bill, a 2% property tax increase is an $80 increase over the course of the year. That's what comes to you in real-world terms. If you're paying a mortgage, you divide that by 12, and you get a number that is so small that it really won't affect your monthly mortgage payment. And that's an important thing to understand, because when you lead with the tax number and you lead with that this is a number that hasn't been precedented, you don't put it into the context of A, property tax cap, B, comparable counties, Putnam and Rockland, C, that we did a 2% last year and the philosophy was low and slow, and not spiking these things high up, and you don't take what that 2% means to the average homeowner when the school taxes are the much higher portion of the property taxes, then not purposely, but it misrepresents what this impact is. And I think we have to represent this impact properly, because we house prisoners with that 2%. We run our bus system with that 2%. We treat your sewage with that 2%. And we cannot, year after year after year, tell ourselves that we will never pay anything more in county property taxes and still be able to house the inmates and treat the sewerage and run the bus system. We also don't know the impact, as I alluded to before, of the SALT deduction, and we're all going to see what happens. As we plan for the future, very clearly I've spoken about this with my former colleagues who serve in the state legislature and also with those who are in the gubernatorial administration, that we intend, and we're not the only one, other major counties, Suffolk, Nassau, other counties are going to be meeting with our state legislature in the new year to talk about revenue streams that we can capture from Albany, whether it's a direct allocation of money or it is the authority to obtain resources so that we can have exactly what the bond rating agencies and the state controller wants us to see, a steady stream of non-property tax revenue. That can come from any number of different sources. I've mentioned internet sales tax in general. There's issues relating to support for transit aid, STOA aid. There's the potential that the state may enter into sports gaming programs, make them legal, and then tax them. And certainly with the presence of Empire City / MGM Grand in the county, I suspect they would go in to try to be a source or a location for that. And we would like to have a discussion about what the county's role in revenue is. Ride-sharing revenues, we get none of the Uber and Lyft resources as it stands right now. Whether or not we're going to look at the red light camera issue again and all these different things. But we intend to spend time in Albany in January. I'm accustomed to going up there, so it's no big surprise. But we're going to try to make a case. We're trying to run this government as best as we can. We're trying to run it across the aisle with cooperation. We're trying to run it with an openness and a transparency to the public. We're out in the community listening to people no matter what their point of view is. We're trying to figure out how not to go off the deep end with one-shots, but at the same time get us through the day we're in. Help us. Help us run this government so we can treat the sewerage and we can deal with the homeless people right now who are in downtown Yonkers or downtown Peekskill. And we have an obligation to deal with that as we do with everything else. That is how we hope to plan for the future as we go forward. In closing, I know this is kind of a long narrative, both on video and in person. I recognize that this is the last major thing that happens in a year, in a calendar year, before we go into the new year. As I said, it's about a year, just over a year since I was elected to this position. I'm very fortunate that I have some very talented people working with me. Ken Jenkins has been a fabulous deputy county executive and has been able to add value in every single area of this county government. I've referenced already the role that Joan McDonald and John Nona have played in their respective positions. You have experienced as members of the press how Catherine Chaffee has worked and the openness and the communications between her and Joe Scamato and Carolyn Fortino and Chelsea Pagano and now Emily Lavitt and all these people here. We brought a host of people into county government on this floor and on other floors, people who are sitting right amongst us with energy and drive. Martha Lopez, Blanca Lopez, Shari Rosen Asher, Crystal Collins, Peter McCart, Aviva Meyer, all on and on and on. We've brought new commissioners on board. We've promoted from within with Tom Gleason and Norma Drummond. We've kept people on, as I've said before, and when we've made changes, we brought in Dr. Demia Harris-Madden. This is the way we're trying to run this government. We need a budget to run this government on. We believe, depending on how the Board of Legislators ultimately deals with these things, that we can run this government in 2019 and set the stage, if we're successful in Albany, with being able to run this government in 2020 and 2021, which is the writ of our authority, to do a good job within the 4 years that we've been given, 1 year's in the books almost, to do this job well, and to do it cooperatively, to do it with respect, to do it with appreciation for the fact that this is a small d democracy. It is not a dictatorship of me or anybody else. And if we can do that in this one small little corner of the county, in the country, then we're doing what we can do to try to say this is what self-governance is. This is us. It's us doing this. It's us figuring out how to do what's very hard to do it for a year, do it for 2 years, put this county on a certain track, and then let it go. And then let it be a good, positive thing for all of us. So with that, I'm going to take questions, and then when we're finished with the questions, I'm going to invite the chairman of the board to get the official handoff of the budget. When roles were reversed 20 years ago, and I got it handed off to me when I was board chairman, and Ken, I guess Ken didn't have that experience. Sorry, buddy.
Nope.
But when I turn it over to Ben, I'm going to have relief, and it's going to be your headache, Mr. Boykin. But until then, I'm happy to answer any of the many questions that the press has, I'm sure. Okay, thank you. Questions? Oh, my God. I put them all to sleep. Good. Well, in that case, I'm sorry. David, I almost slipped it under the wire.
Yeah, could you explain a little bit more about the one shot on the parking there? Are you selling that off to the LDC, the revenues?
Yes, it's a sale. It's a sale from the county government to a separate entity. David, it looks a lot like things that you've seen in the state government. It's a transfer of authority that doesn't functionally change the decision-making of what happens at the parking lot, but it does take it off of our books and allows us to bring our budget into line. The LDC, the Local Development Corporation, is empowered to obtain it and then be responsible for the running of it. And the setting of fees at that parking lot will reflect the revenue that it gets in order to function, maintain it, and move forward.
So where does the $22 million come from?
Comes from the LDC and the resources that they've accumulated over time.
They're paying you $22 million?
Not paying me anything. They're paying to the. Larry, do you want to just
Sure, absolutely. Yeah,
just address the?
Larry, just stand at the mic.
Yeah, I'm going to
Last
step
name,
back.
please.
Yes, last name is Soule, S-O-U-L-E. So the idea is that the LDC would issue some form of debt, either a loan from a financial institution, bonds, and that the debt service on those bonds would be paid back from the revenue generated at the parking facility. So from those bonds, they would in turn pay the county up front that money. And either, they would likely contract with Parks, who currently manages it, and pay a fee for Parks to continue to manage the parking facility.
Does the transfer become effective?
Well, we're assuming that the transaction will close before the end of 2019. So in order to realize the revenue in the 2019 budget.
How much revenue do we currently get from the parking?
I think it's about $2.5 million. A lot of that is commuter parking as opposed to event parking at the county center. And the number that we estimated assumes revenues stay pretty much at the same level, so not massive increases in the parking fees, but a steady, annual increase at the rate of inflation is what is assumed. And, they'd have to maintain a coverage ratio on the bonds they issue. That's how we came up with the estimate.
And will they have control of the rates, or will the county?
I think to the extent the county controls appoints the board of the entity, then I would say the county would control the rate at the parking facility.
Any other questions on the LDC, or are we going to go back to general questions? Tony, general question?
Yes, please.
Go ahead.
I'm not a numbers guy, which is why I do what I do. I am a little confused, and it brings to mind, coming home and saying, honey, I saved you $600 at Target because I only spent $400 at Target.
We're married to the same person, I think.
The Liberty Lines thing. So you're saying you're saving $4 million because you're only paying them $6 million more rather than $10 million.
What we're saying is the cost would have been $10 million,
okay,
and we would have had a $4 million additional expense. And by purposes of their negotiation, they saved $4 million, so that the impact is $6 million, not $10 million.
It was the contract. It was in the contract.
Yeah, it was negotiated. It's a 5-year contract.
Right.
It was the negotiated terms of the contract that reduced what would have been a $10 million hit to the budget and made it a $6 million
The
hit.
$10 million was budgeted somewhere at some point, and you've reduced it to $6 million?
Yeah, the increase is $6 million.
Right.
So when we got the Liberty Lines contract, and we had the first 5 years, and the contract allowed for a 5-year extension. If we had extended it for 5 years under the identical terms and conditions of the first 5 years, it would have been a $10 million increase as opposed to a $6 million increase.
Which was proposed.
So if we kept the exact same contract, it would have been a $10 million increase as opposed to a $6 million increase.
Okay.
And that was, yeah, when you do 5-year budgeting, you look at those things.
So that $10 million was baked into something at some
Yes.
point, and now you.
We've sliced off 4.
And Tony, if I can just add one other fact for this, and it's important to note that the Board of Acquisitions and Contracts was prepared to approve a 5-year extension as is in December. It was objections that were raised by members of the Board of Legislators and some dialogue. I was in the transition period, so I had no authority on this, in which basically we wanted to have the right to take a look at the contract rather than having extended. The contract itself didn't expire until the end of this year. The 5-year extension would have occurred, before the end of 2017. It would have overshot the tenure of this administration. So by not extending it in 5-year period of time, we had the chance to renegotiate it and then realize the savings. Keep in mind the savings that we talked about. is not reflected as something to close the budget. It's closed. It's reflected as that which we have to pay additional. The $6 million is an additional spending that adds up to the $98 million of spending. So we're not saying that the $4 million we saved is $4 million off of closing the budget. We're just saying that this is why we have a $6 million additional expenditure, which could have been a $10 million expenditure. This is exactly what your wife tells you when she comes home. Exactly the same thing. I would have spent $500. I only spent $250.
Right. Well, thank you for clarifying. Are you disappointed, as someone who has spent a lot of time in Albany, are you disappointed that the state has not worked more quickly, given the Supreme Court ruling, to implement sports betting? And obviously MGM is buying Yonkers because they're looking at the big picture on down the road and hoping that there are live table games there sooner rather than later. Have you taken a stand on that? Would you like to see that?
Well, yeah, no, I support sports betting. I think it is a practical reality in this world, aside from the fact that I am a big sports fan and so forth. And New Jersey has jumped into the market immediately. So in the competitive marketplace, we need to be able to capture revenue before we lose it to other neighboring states. But keep in mind, many of these decisions were not made during the time frame in which the legislature was in session. The legislature is in session until the end of June. The Supreme Court decision on internet sales came later. The sports betting debate has become more robust over the course of the year. And then there's a practical reality of it. To call the legislature state legislature for special session is a major effort. Had they been called back in to deal with one or two of these issues, there were 4 or 5 other very hotly controversial issues that, frankly, others didn't want to deal with at the time. And if you brought back in for that, then you'd be dealing with those issues. So I understood pretty early on that we weren't going to see any action on it during 2018. I think it's a realistic expectation. They're not running for office in 19, and I expect them to deal with these issues fairly early on in the process.
And then table gaming at Yonkers, is that something you'd like to see?
Well, yes, but I think here's where you are with gaming, and this is outside of our responsibility or control as a county government. The state authorized 7 licenses for new casinos. 4 of them were authorized, and those casinos have been built throughout upstate New York. There are 3 additional licenses that can be granted in the downstate region, and the thought of the governor at the time that he made the announcement was to let the upstate casinos open up, sort of develop their market before you open the downstate ones, because anything downstate is going to immediately have the bigger base of population to draw from. And I have advocated as a state official that the Yonkers site be given one of those 3 authorities and expand what is now a racino or whatever it was originally structured as into a full gaming unit. I think that's appropriate given the presence of it. It's the 2nd most profitable casino in the state behind the one out at Aqueduct. And in fact, I've been told statistics, I'm not sure if I've got it exactly right, but the profit made in a casino like Empire City exceeds anything that happens in Vegas. You know, you think of great places you might have ever visited in Vegas, you know, Bellagio, any of those places, that we make more profit in something like this because the volume of population is so great and so continual just to play slots and electronic table games that it's a profitable process for us.
If I could just ask one more question.
Yes.
So the internet tax that you're thinking creatively about, the Uber, the Lyft, the Airbnb, and home exchange and all that, these are things that typically have not been taxed. The county has not gotten a piece of this. So what's the philosophy behind broadening the search for revenue beyond fees, fines, and property taxes? The
philosophy behind it is this. Property taxation, in my judgment, should cover property level services. If you own a piece of property, the services that go to serve that property should be paid for through property taxes. Police services are driven around your physical reality. Fire services, sewerage, sanitation, snow removal. We are at a point where the county government, which has, prior to this year, been primarily heavily a property tax level of government, have been providing societal services. When we provide services like correction, probation, a community college function, and a host of other things, there we're providing societal services that really shouldn't be based on the property tax wealth or availability. within a county government, and even more so in a local government. So philosophically, it seems to me that we need a diverse amount of revenue streams so as to take the heavy burden off of the property taxpayer and put it onto people who frankly use things. If I get into a taxi cab or ride sharing use, I'm using a service and I'm paying a tax to use that service. Same thing of sales tax. You could buy a lamp and I could buy a lamp. You could buy a more expensive lamp than me. You pay a little more sales tax on the more expensive lamp. But that's discretionary. If you own a piece of land, that's not discretionary. Wherever you live, you're getting a property tax bill to provide certain services. And now, in the area of schools, well outside of our responsibility as a county government, schools, 2/3 of your property tax basis and funded by the relative property tax wealth of the community. How is a Mount Vernon ever going to provide equal educational services compared to those communities that are wealthy? But that's a societal problem. That's a governor level problem. That's a presidential level problem. Here in the county government, we look at alternate additional means of revenue to try to reduce the pressure on the property taxpayer to provide the services that we're required to provide, many of which are not just property-based services, but are societal services as well. Yes, Michelle. Well, the bottom line, I think, Michelle, comes from a couple of the major things that you're aware of. We did not negotiate our labor contracts in a timely fashion. Had we done that, we wouldn't have had the backfill that we did, having to close out the contract as we did. We, over the course of the prior 8 years, could have had a particular policy toward revenue raising, which we did not have. There was a philosophy, I would argue, an ideology. And that ideology prevented us from making reasonable contributions to additional revenue, which could have helped us fund things in a more reasonable fashion. And if you did it slowly and regularly over a period of time, it wouldn't be as hard a gap to close as it is now. And by the way, this is precedented in so many other places. If you look at the crisis that Rockland went through a few years ago, Ed Day came in as county executive. He resolved a big budget crisis. That budget crisis came because his predecessor went through a number of years where he cut property taxes or lowered it, good politics, bad fiscal finance, and then it came home to roost, and Ed had to dig out of that hole. Nassau County, the same situation. They have a fiscal review board now because it was the same situation. They weren't prepared to raise taxes to cover the things that they were spending for. And they had some heavy union contracts out in Nassau County. The mother of all of them 40 years ago, not anything that you would have contemporary knowledge of, but the New York City budget crisis of the 70s. In every one of those cases, it was decision-making made to have a certain level of services, but not taxed to provide those services, and try to have it both ways. And you can't have it both ways. If you're going to provide the service, you have to provide the revenue for it. You can do it rationally, low and slow, or you can kick the can down the road, and then sooner or later you get to that point at which you have to pay for that which you've accumulated, and that's what we've reached now. So the $60 million gap represents that. We think that if we have some additional non-property tax revenue, that we won't see a gap like that. We will be able to target money to go into the reserve fund, build the reserve fund back up to a number that would be considered respectable. But it's going to take a number of years, as we all know. When you take 5 or 6 or 7 years to get to a point, it probably takes the equal amount of time to move back in a different point. Other questions? If we realize this is only the beginning of a process, then we're happy to be available, all of us in the executive branch, to the legislature, to the members of the press, even to the members of the public at these coffees and conversations, so we can answer as many questions as we can. Mr. Boykin? It is our obligation to your legislature to present you with this. Good luck, my friend. It's all yours. Thank you for your time.